Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today, which is about the humanities. So I preached a couple of weeks ago about Nathan and the Old Testament and a little behind the scenes action. Sometimes I call up my old professors whenever I read an interesting article or I don't know something, and I say, hey, I must have fallen asleep during class. Can you tell me something about the prophet Nathan? So I called up my old professors, one of whom is now the provost at a Presbyterian school, Schreiner University in Kerrville, Texas. He doesn't teach Hebrew Bible anymore, but he's the provost and been thinking about new ways to do higher education in the age of COVID or after the age of COVID. Even before the pandemic, he was asking himself, what's the place of an expensive university degree? How do you increase diversity, and how do you underscore the importance of higher education, a four-year degree, or the humanities? So after talking with him this past week, he told me an interesting story that had absolutely nothing to do with the prophet Nathan or the Hebrew Bible. At least that didn't come up so much in our conversation. I might make a pitch that it does have something to do with our Bible stories. Here's what he told me that I found so compelling, and I've been thinking about since we've talked. What if you taught Shakespeare to cops? Or what if you told the story of Macbeth in prisons? What would be the value of having a class that's tragic comedy and criminal justice? Well, there's actually a person named Jeffrey Wilson who teaches at Harvard, who teaches literature and criminal justice. Why would those two things go together? Is it too hoity-toity or flighty to think that criminals who've been convicted and are behind bars, or that police who have difficult things that they need to be doing, is it a waste of time for them to think about Shakespeare? Is it not very brass tacks for us to consider the stories of Adam and Eve and Noah, Nathan, David and Goliath, and those sorts of things? Are stories something we do in our leisure time, and should we rather have schools set up so that we learn things like STEM and the brass tacks, the things that make money? There's a compelling reason, I think, according to my professor, according to Jeffrey Wilson, about why the humanities matter. And I might add, why it's important for us to imbibe and eat these stories of the Bible, of great literature, because they help us to think about the human condition. They help to contextualize and frame our most important questions, which helps us to understand those so-called brass tacks. How do we know what would be brass or what would be ivory if we don't have stories to help us frame what's important? It's the humanities, maybe with or maybe without the $10,000, tens of thousands of dollar degrees that go with them, to help us understand who we are and why we are and the goals which we seek to understand. If it's the case that people seek after simple power, winning an election, putting a person behind bars, making money without some contextualization of what those things are for, without thinking about the big questions of life, then what sort of society do we create? That was his initial pitch for the humanities. But even more specifically, I was interested for why Shakespeare might be important for policing. How do the stories of criminals, criminal minds, and bad intentions play into our role in society about thinking about the role of police or police reform, or having a society that reflects positively on what good behavior might be and what bad behavior might be? I think in a lot of ways we learn those from stories, and I have some examples of that. So if you have a little more time and you're interested in the ways that those stories frame our right behavior and what it means to correct those behaviors, or to punish bad people, to reward good people, these are the things I've been musing about. So if you have a little time and if you're interested, I hope you'll stick around. So again, this professor friend of mine turned me on to the idea of Shakespeare for cops, an actual program that helps us to think about, helps me to think about at least, the role of humanities in different sorts of disciplines, being interdisciplinary and why that might be something positive. On that rabbit trail that he pushed me gently into, I read this quote from Tim Smith. "Intelligence and ethics are not personality traits that some people have and some people don't. These things are talents that can be learned and skills that can be practiced." By reading stories or case studies where we see dramatic conflict within certain characters, that's how we flex our ethical and imaginative muscles about what we would do in a certain context. And I'll give a couple of examples that I have noticed. It's kind of a trope in Disney movies. I've noticed it in Peter Pan. I've noticed it in Beauty and the Beast. I'm pretty sure it happens in Batman. That's not Disney. And I wonder where you noticed it as well. In Peter Pan, towards the end of the movie, there is a dramatic fight between Peter and Captain Hook. Peter says that he won't fly and that because Hook has only one hand, he can fight him with one hand behind his back. Hook seems to have the upper hand, and then all of a sudden Peter makes a dramatic move, one hand behind his back, without flying. Hook is wrapped up in a rope. Peter takes his sword and stands there with Hook completely at Peter's mercy. Hook begs for his life, and so Peter, being the merciful hero of the story, relents. And just when he relents, Hook takes one more desperate effort to get at Peter. He takes his sword back and tries to run him through, but then Peter is able to avoid that disaster, and we realize having mercy on Hook, on a criminal, on a bad guy, is a bad idea. Bad people will always be bad. We need to see and understand them for who they are, and so Hook has to be banished by force. The same thing happens in Beauty and the Beast. When the Beast is being attacked by Gaston, the Beast has mercy. He holds Gaston over a rainy roof and is ready to drop him. Belle yells out from the tower, telling him in not so many words, "Don't be the beast that you look like, be a person of compassion," a good lesson. And so we are able to understand that the beast, who might look terrifying, is not as terrible as Gaston. So the beast relents and puts Gaston gently back on the roof, and the beast runs to Belle, his love, to be embraced for the compassionate, strong hero that he is. But just as he's climbing the roof, we see him wince in agony because Gaston has returned for one last stab. So by no fault of his own, the beast throws himself and Gaston is cast off the roof. What's the moral of the story? Bad guys are bad guys, and when we seek to be merciful to them, they will only use that to their advantage. It would be silly to be merciful on bad guys when we know they're the bad guys, especially in a Disney movie. Shakespeare is a little more complicated than some of the Disney movies, even though I think The Lion King is some mashup of Hamlet and Macbeth and I don't know what. When we have complicated stories with dynamic and complicated characters, we reframe our understanding of who is bad and who is not. In the story of Macbeth, we can recognize Macbeth even today as a veteran who's suffering from something like PTSD. In the stories of the Bible, we recognize Noah, who saves his family, saves a remnant of society, but then it turns out he's a drunkard. In the story of Peter, we see someone who is quick to jump to faithfulness, but who also denies Jesus 3 times, trying to create space and protection for himself rather than being associated with someone who was just crucified. Is Peter a good or a bad character, or a dynamic character? Is Noah good or bad? Is Abraham, when he binds his son, good or bad? Is it faithful to listen to God whenever God says, bind your son? Or is he simply a terrible father who shouldn't have sought after that God in the first place? Or do we hear multiple voices from God and those get confused, and we should read that into the story of the binding of Isaac? The reason these stories have existed so long, the reason why I think it's good to return to them, even though we might not read our Bibles as often as we're supposed to, but the reason we turn is that these are compelling, dynamic characters, as compelling and dynamic as we are. I like the notion that the reason for the Sabbath is that in our workaday world, when there is plenty to tend to, God demands of us a holy day, a day set apart for big ideas. Who are we? Whose are we? What is the place of love, peace, and justice in the world? And how does this one day, a seventh of our time, compel us in the other 6 days when we get to the brass tacks, when we get to work? What if we understood the Sabbath not as a day only for R&R, but as a day for big ideas, for the humanities? If in some ways that's what God has demanded of us in the 10 Commandments, the fourth of the 10, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, keep it set apart for big ideas, how would we somehow transfer space for big ideas to other arenas of life? To a college curriculum, to work in an office, whether in business or criminal justice or something else. And inversely, how do we take the ivory tower disciplines, the social sciences, the humanities, and say that somehow these should be impacting those brass tacks things that we have to do? If you don't read anything in your office but manuals and how-tos, how might you infuse the big ideas about why you do what you do? How do you have discussion with your employees, your coworkers, your families about how you serve humanity in the larger scope of things? I think that's what the humanities seeks to offer. In the ways that we tell stories, in the ways that we are philosophical, that there should be space for big ideas. One day for being completely imaginative. And maybe, just maybe, this has something to do with how we think about the hardest issues of our time. If we seek criminal justice reform, if we seek racial equity, that these things are not solved only in specific metrics. We need some stories or some frames that help us to understand why we would use those metrics in the first place. And the last thing I'll say, which I hope you don't stop listening, but maybe you should, is that it's interesting to me how the social studies become social sciences. That the art of politicking and thinking about a good republic, which would be something that Plato talked about in the Republic, read in a philosophy class, how does that get transferred into something in a political science class? My understanding when I watch the news or I think about political science classes is that you might have a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of Plato, or a little bit of the Greeks, the classics, the humanities. But somehow the technical skills of doing a focus group, doing a poll, and looking at the numbers, thinking about how you would do fundraising for a campaign, I think that plays a larger role now than it used to. So how do we understand polling and opinion over and against what it means to be, in the Republic, a philosopher king? One who has a good idea about how society would be structured and how the philosopher might have a better grasp on the truths of things like democracy, justice, and peace than what a focus group might provide in a simple poll. It's important for us as a society and as a church to take the time that's necessary, because it's not easy work, to think about what we mean when we talk about peace, justice, equity, and what is equitable. Are those even the goals which we seek to pursue? Or can we poll people enough that they are knowledgeable enough on their own, with their own opinions, and without good, creative, humanitarian discussion, and we follow the majority? I think that's what's at stake in what is sometimes negatively called populism over and against the humanities and people who have the leisure time to think about these things. My hope is that more of us think about these things, that we force and enforce time to be able to think about the big picture, our biggest hopes, and our greatest fears, and how we seek to address them. Complex stories like we have in Shakespeare, like we have in the Bible, and like we have in a million other places are important as we seek to move forward. If we seek to move forward, sometimes it's important to look back where we came from, and maybe people like Shakespeare or Plato or millions of others are worth a look, to orient us to the ways that we have had the best of humanitarian thought and how we might move forward in equitable and just ways. What does that mean as you hear it? What are your biggest hopes? What are your biggest fears? And what sources do we already have at our disposal to explore to create the kind of beloved community that we seek? That's what I've been musing about this week. I wonder how the classics or humanities might fit in to your workaday world and how you might seek to create time for them. Maybe just in a Bible study in the morning, a little time for prayer, maybe it helps you to touch base with those big ideas that might have a lot of potential for how you move, act, and breathe in the world. That's what I've been musing about this week. I hope you will muse about some of that as well. I'll give you time to do that, and then I'll see you next Monday.